Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something a little different, a little bit more, I don't know, raw.
Oh, getting real with it.
Yeah. Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. Have you had a chance to read it?
Oh yeah. It's definitely not your typical business book.
Not all sunshine and roses, that's for sure.
No, not at all. He really digs into the I guess you could say the nitty-gritty of what it actually takes to build and run, especially like a tech company.
And he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff, right?
No, not at all. He even uses phrases like feeling like you're going to die. That's how intense it gets sometimes, you know?
Yeah. And he even came up with this term CEO Tourette's syndrome to describe the kind of pressure that comes with the job.
It's pretty vivid imagery.
It is. Okay, so we've got excerpts from the book ready to go. Are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
So one of the things that really struck me about the book is, well, first of all, that Horowitz doesn't buy into that whole stay positive no matter what mantra. He really kind of embraces the struggle.
That's one of the things I found so fascinating about his perspective. He's not afraid to admit that being a CEO, especially at a startup, is just plain hard.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, hey, this is going to be tough. There are going to be moments where you feel like you're drowning.
Yeah, and he really drives that home with his own experiences. He talks about how he felt like he was actually literally going to die when his first company, Loudcloud, hit a major financial crisis.
Right, right. It's that vulnerability, that honesty that I think is so powerful.
It makes you realize that these feelings of fear, of isolation, of just sheer overwhelm, they're not unique to you. It's something a lot of leaders go through. And by talking about it openly, he kind of normalizes it.
It's like he's giving permission to say, hey, this is hard. I'm struggling. And then he goes on to give this piece of advice that seems so counterintuitive at first. He says, be brutally honest with your team.
Yeah, I remember thinking, wait, shouldn't you be trying to keep morale up? Shouldn't you be the optimistic one? But he makes a really compelling argument for transparency.
So how does that work? How does honesty actually build a stronger team?
Well, he argues that when a leader is upfront about the challenges, about the problems, it shows a level of trust in their team. It's like saying, hey, we're all in this together. We're going to face these obstacles as a team.
So instead of trying to shield people from the bad news, you're actually bringing them into the fold.
Exactly. And that creates a sense of shared responsibility, a sense of ownership. It's not just blind optimism, it's informed action.
I like that. So it's about empowerment, not just, I don't know, sugarcoating reality.
Right. And he gives this great example from his own experience at Opsware, his second company. He talks about losing a major sales prospect. Now, most leaders would probably try to downplay that, but Horowitz did the opposite. He shared the news openly with his team, turning it into a learning opportunity.
I love that approach.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, oh, it's fine, we'll get the next one, he's saying, okay, we mess up here. Let's figure out why and how we can do better next time.
And it's that kind of honesty that builds trust and fosters a more resilient culture, a culture where people aren't afraid to take risks, to experiment, to make mistakes, because they know they'll be supported, not punished for it.
And this idea of building a strong culture, a good company, as he calls it, is a recurring theme throughout the book, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's one of his core beliefs. He learned a lot about this from Bill Campbell, the legendary coach and mentor to so many Silicon Valley leaders.
Yeah, Bill Campbell, a guy who was basically a CEO whisperer.
Exactly. And Campbell was known for building companies where people felt valued, respected, supported, even in the face of failure.
Like at Go Corporation. That was a company that ultimately didn't succeed financially, but it had a profound impact on the people who worked there.
And for Horowitz, that experience was a real turning point. It made him realize that success isn't just about the bottom line, it's about the impact you have on people's lives.
So it's about creating a work environment where people feel like they're part of something meaningful, something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And he believes that investing in your team, in training and development, is crucial to building that kind of company. He's actually a huge advocate for training.
Which, again, seems a little counterintuitive at first.
Yeah.
Right? Especially in the startup world where it's all about moving fast and breaking things.
Right. You'd think training would be seen as this kind of nice-to-have perk, but not a necessity. But Horowitz takes a very different view. He sees training as an investment, not an expense.
And he gets that from Andy Grove, right? High output management, that whole philosophy of like training is the boss's job.
Exactly. And he talks about how at Netscape he created this simple document called Good Product Manager, Bad Product Manager. And it was basically a list of like the qualities and behaviors of effective product managers.
That's interesting. So it wasn't like some elaborate training program, just a clear, concise document that outlined the expectations.
Right. And he says it had a huge impact on his team's performance. It helped people understand what was expected of them, how to improve, and how to contribute more effectively.
So simple but effective.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about honesty, building a good company, investing in people. But let's face it, running a business, especially a startup, is not all sunshine and team-building exercises. There are some really tough decisions that leaders have to make, and Horowitz doesn't shy away from that either.
No, he definitely doesn't. He dedicates a whole section of the book to navigating those tricky people situations. You know, the ones that keep you up at night.
Like firing executives.
Firing executives, demoting friends, dealing with those employees who are brilliant but just impossible to work with.
Yeah. It's the human side of leadership, the part that nobody really wants to talk about, but it's so real.
And Horowitz is brutally honest about his own struggles in these areas. He talks about the gut-wrenching experience of having to fire an executive after recruiting them with all these promises and painting this rosy picture of the future.
Yeah, I can imagine how difficult that would be.
And he talks about how he learned the hard way that sometimes, no matter how much you want someone to succeed, it's just not going to work out. And you have to make that tough call, even if it hurts.
And it's not just about firing people, it's also about those situations where you have to demote someone, maybe even a close friend.
Right. And he uses this example of Mitchell and Kathy, two people he worked with, to illustrate just how messy and complicated those situations can get.
So it's about navigating those personal relationships, those loyalties, while also trying to do what's best for the company.
Mhm.
That's a tough balancing act.
It really is. And he doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does provide a framework for thinking about those tough people decisions. He talks about the importance of clear communication, of setting expectations, of having a fair process, and of acting decisively even when it's uncomfortable.
And then there's the whole category of what he calls smart but bad employees.
Right.
The people who are incredibly talented but also incredibly difficult to manage.
Oh, yeah. He breaks them down into these really distinct categories, like the heretic, the flake, and the jerk.
It's almost like a field guide to difficult personalities, but in a funny way, you know?
Yeah. He injects a bit of humor into it, which I think is helpful because, let's face it, these situations can be so stressful.
Okay, so you've got the heretic who's always challenging authority, questioning everything. Then you've got the flake who's unreliable, inconsistent, constantly missing deadlines.
And then, of course, there's the jerk, who's just, well, a jerk. Abrasive, disrespectful, creating a toxic environment for everyone around them.
And what's Horowitz's advice for dealing with these types?
He's pretty straightforward. Get rid of them. He says you can't afford to let these personalities poison your company culture, no matter how talented they might be.
It's that whole idea of, like, one bad apple can spoil the bunch.
Right. And he uses that great analogy from John Madden, the legendary football coach. Madden said, if you hold the bus for everyone on the team, then you'll be so late you'll miss the game.
I love that. So it's about setting standards, about having expectations, and about not making exceptions for everyone.
Exactly. But he also adds that sometimes you might have a player who's so good that you do hold the bus for them.
So it's knowing when to bend the rules and for whom. Which is tricky, right? Because you don't want to create a culture of favoritism or double standards.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance, but it's also about recognizing that sometimes you have to make exceptions for truly exceptional people.
Okay, so all of this talk about tough people decisions kind of leads into Horowitz's thoughts on building a strong company culture. And one of the things he's very clear about is that culture is not about superficial perks.
No, he's adamant about that. He says real culture is about establishing core values that actually drive behavior and decisions at every level of the company. It's not about ping pong tables or free snacks.
It's about, like, what people actually believe in and how they act on those beliefs.
Exactly. And he uses these really vivid examples to make his point, like Amazon's early use of desks made from doors. It wasn't about being cheap. It was a symbolic gesture that reinforced their culture of frugality and resourcefulness.
It's like we're scrappy, we're resourceful, we make do with what we have.
Exactly. And it's those kind of tangible expressions of your values that really sink in and shape the way people behave. It's not just lip service, it's baked into the environment.
And he contrasts that with, the more superficial perks like having dogs at work or offering yoga classes. Those things can be nice, but they don't define a company's core identity.
And he points to Netflix as an example of a company with a really strong culture. their whole freedom and responsibility philosophy, where employees are given a lot of autonomy but also held accountable for their results.
So it's about trust, but also about performance. It's not just a free-for-all.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that building a strong culture is a deliberate act. It takes careful thought, clear communication, and consistent reinforcement from the leadership team.
You can't just, put up a mission statement on the wall and expect it to magically happen.
No, you have to actively cultivate it.
Okay, so we've talked about honesty, culture, tough decisions. But of course, no conversation about entrepreneurship would be complete without talking about that big, often emotional decision of whether to sell your company.
Right. And Horowitz, having sold Opsware to HP, speaks from experience here. He describes it as this incredibly complex decision, one that's fraught with tension between pursuing your vision and, well, maximizing your financial outcome.
And he doesn't shy away from the emotional side of it either. He talks about the pressure he felt from investors, the internal conflict he experienced, even feeling physically sick after making the decision.
Yeah, he talks about sleepless nights, cold sweats, like he was going through withdrawal. It really highlights the profound connection that founders have with their companies. It's not just a business, it's like a part of them.
So it's not just a rational decision, it's also a deeply personal one.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes that there's no right or wrong answer. It's about weighing all those factors, the analytical and the emotional, and making the choice that feels right for you, for your company, and for your team.
Okay, so before we move on, I want to throw this out to our listener. Have you ever faced a really tough decision, whether in your personal life or your work life, where you just didn't know what the right answer was? How did you approach it? What factors did you consider?
It's something to think about as we continue exploring the hard thing about hard things. So, we were just talking about selling a company, but let's back up a little bit and talk about why Horowitz is such a firm believer in founders running their own companies.
Yeah, it seems to be like a core principle for him, right? Especially in the tech world. Like he really sees that connection between the founder and the company's success.
Exactly. He argues that it's not just about having a brilliant idea, it's about having that deep understanding of the vision, the passion to see it through, no matter what obstacles come up.
So it's about more than just, business acumen or management skills. It's about that almost, I don't know, intuitive connection to the product, to the mission.
Exactly. And that's where his concept of the peacetime CEO versus the wartime CEO comes in.
Ah, yes, the classic Horowitz dichotomy. I love this part. Can you explain that for our listener who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. So imagine, two different styles of leadership. You've got the peacetime CEO who thrives in a stable environment. When things are running smoothly, they're great at building systems, empowering teams, optimizing for efficiency.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah. Exactly. But then you have the wartime CEO. This leader emerges when the company's facing like an existential threat, a competitor disrupting the market, a product failure, a financial crisis, those make or break moments.
And it's like all hands on deck battle stations.
Exactly. And the wartime CEO is decisive, maybe even a little ruthless, laser focused on survival. They're willing to make those tough calls, rewrite the rules, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
So is Horowitz saying that founders are just naturally better being wartime CEOs?
That's his argument.
Yeah.
He believes that because founders have been there from day one, they've battled through those early struggles, they have this inherent understanding of what it takes to fight for survival. They've got that grit.
It's like they've been through a leadership boot camp just by building a company from scratch.
Right. He contrasts this with what he calls the professional CEO, who often comes from, a more traditional corporate background where they've risen through the ranks in a more structured, predictable environment.
So they might be great at managing, established systems and processes, but maybe not as comfortable with chaos and uncertainty.
Exactly. He's not saying that professional CEOs can't be successful, but he believes they might lack that deep, intuitive understanding of the product, the market, the company's DNA that founders have.
It's like that founder's instinct, that almost sixth sense about what the company needs to survive and thrive.
Right. And he points to companies like, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, all these iconic tech companies that were founded and led by technical visionaries, people who were deeply passionate about their products and their missions. But of course, he acknowledges that it's not a guaranteed formula for success.
Right. There are plenty of founder-led companies that have failed.
Absolutely. And he admits that founders can sometimes be too close to their ideas, too resistant to change, maybe even a bit too quick to dismiss feedback that doesn't align with their vision.
It's that classic founder's dilemma. How do you balance that unwavering conviction with the need to adapt and evolve?
It's a tough balance to strike. And he also acknowledges that, not all founders have what it takes to be CEOs. Some are brilliant at building the product or the technology, but maybe not so great at managing people or scaling a company.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And that's what I appreciate about Horowitz's perspective. He doesn't offer these simplistic solutions or pretend like there's a magic formula.
It's more about providing a framework for thinking about leadership, understanding the different forces at play, and recognizing that there isn't one right answer for every situation.
Exactly. So now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Horowitz's take on building a killer company culture, because this is where things get really interesting.
I love this part of the book because he's very clear about what culture is and what it isn't. Like, he's not buying into the whole, foosball tables and kombucha on tap thing.
Yeah. No, he's not. He argues that true culture is about defining those core values that actually drive behavior and decisions at every level of the company. It's about those underlying principles that shape how people interact, approach problems, and make choices, even when the CEO isn't around.
It's like the company's DNA.
Exactly. And he uses some really memorable examples to drive this point home, like Amazon's early use of desks made from doors. It wasn't about being cheap, it was a powerful statement about frugality and resourcefulness.
Right. It was a tangible representation of their values, something everybody could see and experience every day.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with, things like dogs at work or yoga classes, which, while nice, don't necessarily define a company's core identity.
You can have all the ping pong tables you want, but it doesn't mean you have a strong culture.
He also talks about Netflix's freedom and responsibility culture. They empower their employees to make decisions and own their work, but they also hold them accountable for the results.
So it's about finding that balance between autonomy and accountability.
Exactly. And he stresses that building a strong culture is a deliberate act. It takes careful thought, clear communication, and consistent reinforcement from the leadership team.
It's not something that just magically appears. You have to actively cultivate it.
Absolutely. So, thinking about what we just discussed, what aspects of Horowitz's perspective on culture really stood out to you? What resonated most?
I think for me, it was his emphasis on authenticity. It's not about copying what other successful companies do or chasing trends. It's about staying true to your own values, figuring out what truly aligns with your company's mission and DNA, and then weaving those values into every aspect of the business.
Because at the end of the day, a strong culture is about attracting and retaining people who share those values and are genuinely motivated to contribute to the company's success.
Totally. Okay, so now let's tackle another big challenge that Horowitz talks about, scaling. Because, what works for a team of 10 doesn't always translate to a team of 100 or 1,000.
Absolutely. And he provides a really practical framework for thinking about scaling, breaking it down into 3 key areas: organizational design, process, and people.
Okay, so let's start with organizational design. What are some of his key insights there?
Well, he kicks things off with a rather provocative statement: all organizational designs are bad.
Wow, okay, that's a bold statement.
Yeah. But his point is that any structure you choose will inherently create trade-offs. You might optimize for certain types of communication or decision-making, but it might come at the expense of others.
So it's about acknowledging those trade-offs and making conscious choices about what you're willing to sacrifice.
Exactly. And he talks about how, as a company grows, you need to move beyond that kind of flat, informal structure that works well in a small startup. You need clearer lines of communication, decision-making authority, as you start to specialize and bring in people with different expertise.
Because if everyone's involved in every decision, things can just grind to a halt.
Right. And he talks about that classic dilemma of whether to organize around functions like marketing, sales, engineering, or around missions, where you have these self-contained business units with cross-functional teams.
It's that age-old question of how do you balance specialization with integration?
Exactly. And he really emphasizes the importance of having clear roles and responsibilities, making sure everyone understands where they fit into the bigger picture and how their work contributes to the overall goals.
Because, as a company grows, it's easy for people to feel lost or disconnected, which can lead to silos and miscommunication.
Absolutely. So now let's move on to process. What's Horowitz's take on its role in scaling?
Well, he has this great line: the purpose of process is communication. It's so simple, but so true.
It really is. He acknowledges that as a company scales, informal communication just starts to break down. You need more structured systems for sharing information, making decisions, and coordinating activities across different teams.
Because what works when you can just, walk over to someone's desk and have a quick chat doesn't scale when you have hundreds or thousands of employees in multiple locations.
Exactly. And he talks about the importance of documenting processes so that knowledge isn't locked away in individuals or teams.
It's like creating an institutional memory so that the company can operate effectively even as people come and go.
Right. And of course, he emphasizes the importance of striking that balance between structure and flexibility.
Because too much process can kill creativity and innovation, but too little can lead to chaos and inefficiency.
It's about finding that sweet spot where you have enough structure for consistency and accountability, but not so much that it becomes a burden. It's a constant dance, really, adapting and refining as you grow.
So now let's talk about the people side of scaling. Because ultimately, scaling a company means scaling your team.
And this is where Horowitz's insights on hiring, training, and performance management become even more crucial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are some of his key takeaways in these areas?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of hiring for both skill and cultural fit.
Because you need people who can not only do the job, but who also share the company's values and can thrive in its unique environment.
Right. And he's a big believer in investing in ongoing training and development.
Because, as a company grows and evolves, so do the skills and knowledge that are needed to succeed.
Absolutely. And he also talks about setting clear performance expectations and giving regular feedback.
So people need to know how they're doing, where they can improve, and how their work contributes to the bigger picture.
Right. It's about creating a culture of accountability where people are recognized for their contributions, but also held responsible for their mistakes.
It's about fostering a sense of ownership at every level.
Exactly. Before we move on, I do want to touch on a specific people challenge that Horowitz addresses. Managing those, well, he calls them smart but bad employees.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one. Didn't he come up with, very specific categories for these folks?
He did. He talks about the heretic who's, always challenging the status quo, undermining authority, loves to point out flaws and question everything.
Right, but doesn't necessarily offer any helpful solutions.
Exactly. Then there's the flake who's unreliable, inconsistent, constantly missing deadlines, tons of potential, but just can't seem to get it together.
And then there's, the jerk, right? Who's just abrasive, disrespectful, and basically creates a toxic work environment for everyone around them.
Right. And Horowitz's advice for dealing with these types is pretty straightforward. Get rid of them. He's very clear that you can't afford to let these personalities poison your company culture, no matter how talented they might be.
He's got that great John Madden analogy to illustrate this, right?
Yes. Madden said, you can't hold the bus for everyone. If you do, you'll be so late you'll miss the game. So, you have to have standards. You can't make exceptions for everyone.
Right. But, he also said that sometimes you might have a player who's so good that you hold the bus for them.
And Horowitz applies the same logic to managing employees. You can't tolerate bad behavior from everyone, but you might make an exception for a truly exceptional employee. But even then, you have to tread carefully because you're sending a message to the rest of the team about what's acceptable.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one final point that Horowitz makes that I think is really important. The importance of continuous learning.
Yes. He's a huge advocate for this. He talks about being a CEO as this constant process of learning and adapting because the landscape is always changing, new challenges, new technologies, new market dynamics. You have to constantly evolve to stay ahead of the curve.
It's like if you're not learning, you're falling behind.
Exactly. And he talks about the importance of finding mentors, advisors, peers, people who can offer guidance and support because you can't be an expert in everything, right?
And I love how he encourages reading, attending conferences, just constantly exposing yourself to new ideas. Cultivating that growth mindset.
Exactly. And it's not just about doing, it's about understanding why things worked or didn't work so you can continuously improve. He also talks about sharing your own knowledge and experiences with others.
The more you teach, the more you learn.
Right. And by sharing your insights, you can help others avoid making the same mistakes and achieve greater success. It's about creating this culture of continuous learning and improvement, both for yourself and for the company as a whole.
So, I want to leave our listener with a question to ponder as we move into the final part of our deep dive. How do you approach continuous learning in your own life and work? What are some of the things you do to stay ahead of the curve and keep growing?
It's something to think about as we wrap up our exploration of the hard thing about hard things.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of, the foundational aspects of building a company, but now I really want to get into the nitty-gritty of decision making, especially when it comes to those like really tough calls, where there's no easy answer.
Yeah, and this is where I think Horowitz's experience really shines through. He's been in those situations where, you're staring down a problem and there's no clear path forward. He doesn't pretend it's easy.
He talks about having those going to die moments multiple times in his journey. It's kind of comforting in a weird way to know that even someone as successful as him has felt that level of pressure.
It's like he's giving you permission to feel those things, to acknowledge the weight of those decisions. And he also emphasizes that, making the right call often means going against conventional wisdom, being willing to challenge the status quo.
And sometimes making decisions that are just, plain unpopular.
Absolutely. But he talks about the importance of having a clear set of principles to guide your decision making. Because when you're in the middle of a crisis, emotions are high, time is short. Having those predefined values can really help you stay grounded.
It's like having a North Star,
Yeah.
something to help you navigate through the storm.
Right. And he also talks about gathering as much information as you can, but recognizing that you'll never have all the answers.
And being okay with that,
Yeah.
being comfortable with ambiguity, with making decisions based on incomplete data.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to trust your gut and take that leap of faith.
And once you've made the decision, it's about communicating it clearly,
Yeah,
even if it's not the news people want to hear.
exactly. Transparency is key, even when it's tough. People might not agree with your choice, but if they understand the reasoning behind it, they're more likely to get on board.
So it goes back to that trust factor.
Absolutely. And speaking of tough calls, Horowitz really digs into the whole decision of whether to sell your company. I mean, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I think he captures the emotional roller coaster of that process really well, having been through it himself with Opsware.
Yeah, he talks about weighing all the factors, the market opportunity, the financials, but also those more emotional aspects, like your passion for the business, your commitment to your team.
And the legacy you want to build.
Exactly. And he's really honest about his own experience, the mix of emotions he felt, the excitement, the pride, the sadness, even a bit of regret.
Yeah, he really captures the complexity of that decision.
And he emphasizes that there's no right or wrong answer. It's a deeply personal choice that every founder has to make for themselves.
It's not about following a formula or listening to what everyone else tells you to do. It's about, looking inward and figuring out what truly aligns with your goals and values.
And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that leadership is a journey, not a destination.
It's about constantly learning, growing, adapting, pushing yourself to become the best leader you can be.
And embracing the challenges, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, and seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Absolutely. And remembering that you're not alone in this journey. There are mentors, advisors, peers, and even books like Horowitz's that can offer guidance and support along the way.
So to all those leaders out there who are facing their own hard things, remember that those challenges are what shape you. They're what make you stronger.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the hard thing about hard things.
We'll see you next time.